October 1944. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned. American forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, had returned to the Philippines. The massive invasion of Leyte was underway, an operation involving more than 700 ships and nearly 200,000 men. But behind the headlines of liberation and triumph, the Navy's thin blue line of destroyers faced a brutal and often forgotten task: to protect the vulnerable heart of the invasion fleet. Among those destroyers was a small, fast, and deadly vessel, the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans. Commissioned in October 1943, the Johnston carried a crew of 327 men and bristled with torpedoes, depth charges, and 5-inch guns. She was built for speed and aggression, and her captain was known for both. Evans, a part Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, was not a man of hesitation. On the day he took command, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Those words, at the time, were little more than a fiery statement of intent, but within a year, they would define one of the most heroic and mysterious naval actions in American history. As the Johnston steamed through the Philippine Sea, she became part of Task Unit April 3, 77, call sign Taffy 3. This small group of escort carriers and destroyers was assigned to protect landing troops at Leyte Gulf. Their mission seemed routine: provide air cover, hunt submarines, and shield the transports. No one expected them to face the full fury of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the Japanese, desperate to halt MacArthur's advance, launched Operation Shogo, a complex, multi-pronged plan to crush the American invasion force. It involved decoy carriers in the north and 3 major surface fleets converging from the west. One of those fleets, the powerful Center Force, included battleships and cruisers that had survived earlier attacks in the Sibuyan Sea. Unknown to the men aboard Johnston, that same force was slipping undetected toward their position through the San Bernardino Strait. In the early morning hours of October 25, radar operators aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay detected faint blips on their screens, distant echoes that suggested heavy ships approaching. Confusion spread. It was believed that the San Bernardino Strait was sealed by Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. But Halsey, chasing the decoy carriers far to the north, had left the passage unguarded. As dawn began to rise over the eastern horizon, a scout pilot flying over Samar sent a chilling transmission: "Enemy battleships. My God, there are so many of them." What he saw was staggering. The Japanese Center Force, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was heading directly for Taffy 3. Aboard the Johnston, the crew scrambled to battle stations. The sea was calm, the air thick with tension. Captain Evans took the bridge, scanning the horizon through binoculars. At 0647 hours, he gave the command that would seal his ship's fate: "All engines ahead flank. Prepare for torpedo attack." The destroyer surged forward, her turbines roaring as she cut through the surf toward a fleet that outgunned her 10-1. No orders came from higher command. No reinforcements were nearby. Yet Evans did not hesitate. He was a destroyer man, and destroyers were built to fight, even against impossible odds. The first shells from Japanese cruisers began to land nearby, towering geysers of seawater rising beside the Johnston. The crew returned fire, their 5-inch guns hammering back at targets that barely flinched. On the bridge, Evans shouted over the wind, "Commence attack!" and swung the ship to port, exposing her torpedo tubes. 5 torpedoes sped into the waves, their wakes slicing toward the enemy line. Minutes later, a thunderous explosion erupted aboard the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of action. The men of the Johnston cheered, but their victory was short-lived. The enemy's fire intensified. Shells ripped through the destroyer's hull. Power failed briefly. Communications were cut. Yet the Johnston pressed on, ducking in and out of smoke to protect the escort carriers that were desperately trying to flee. Evans had committed fully to the fight. A single destroyer charging the might of the Imperial Navy. The scene was chaos: burning oil, shattering steel, and the deafening thunder of naval artillery. The Johnston's crew fought with grim determination, firing until barrels overheated and ammunition ran low. One gunner later recalled, It felt like the whole ocean was exploding around us. As the morning wore on, Taffy 3's destroyers joined the fray, inspired by Johnston's example. The small fleet fought like cornered lions, and against all logic, began to turn back the Japanese advance. But for Evans and his crew, the battle was far from over. Damage was mounting. The ship was bleeding speed and power. Still, Evans refused to withdraw. He had made a promise to go in harm's way. As black smoke billowed from her funnel and shells splashed closer with each minute, the Johnston disappeared into the haze, charging once more into the storm of battle. The legend of her final stand was only beginning. The morning of October 25, 1944, began deceptively calm for the men of Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3. A soft dawn light broke over the eastern horizon, the sea smooth, the skies streaked with thin clouds. Aboard the 6 escort carriers, flight crews were preparing for another day of ground support missions over Leyte. The destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, patrolled the perimeter, scanning for submarines. No one imagined that, within an hour, they would be facing the largest surface fleet ever assembled by Japan since Pearl Harbor. At 0647 hours, the calm shattered. Radio operators aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay intercepted a frantic transmission from a reconnaissance pilot. Enemy fleet in sight, bearing 010, distance 17 miles. The pilot's voice broke as he continued, "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, too many to count." Moments later, radar confirmed the nightmare. The Japanese center force, including Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, supported by heavy cruisers like Chokai, Suzuya, and Kumano, was steaming south through the San Bernardino Strait at full speed. The American sailors were stunned. Admiral Halsey's fast battleships were far to the north, chasing a decoy carrier group. The men of Taffy 3 were alone, 6 small jeep carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, facing an armada of over 20 heavy ships. They were outnumbered and outgunned by every measure. Aboard the Johnston, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans wasted no time. He ordered flank speed and directed his crew to make smoke, thick white clouds that would obscure the carriers from Japanese gunners. "Open fire," he commanded. Within moments, the Johnston's 5-inch guns were hammering away, their flashes lighting the smoke like lightning through fog. The destroyer zigzagged toward the advancing Japanese line, firing on targets so large they barely needed aiming. As the first salvos from Japanese cruisers roared in, towering plumes of seawater erupted around the Johnston. One shell struck near the bow, cutting power to the forward guns and killing several crewmen instantly. Evans, undeterred, maneuvered through the chaos with instinctive precision. The Johnston was small, fast, and agile, built for attacks like this. At 0706, Evans made the decision that would etch his name into naval history. Without orders from the task unit commander, he turned hard to port and charged the enemy fleet alone. "Commence torpedo attack," he shouted. The destroyer accelerated to full speed, charging through her own smoke screen and into the open, where the horizon burned with the flash of incoming shells. As the distance closed, the Johnston's crew could see the towering silhouettes of Japanese heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, and Chokai, their 8-inch guns blazing. Evans lined up the attack, his ship shaking under the recoil of its guns. At a range of just 10,000 yards, he fired all 10 torpedoes from both banks. The men braced for impact. Minutes later, a thunderous explosion ripped through the Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her to withdraw. The Japanese line wavered in confusion. Evans turned sharply, using the disruption to slip back into the smoke. His ship had survived the first charge, but the enemy's wrath was only beginning. For the next hour, the Johnston weaved through fire and chaos, shielding the retreating escort carriers. When one of the carriers, Gambier Bay, came under direct fire, the Johnston interposed herself, laying down suppressive fire that momentarily drew Japanese attention. The sea became a maelstrom of burning oil and churning wakes. Destroyer escorts like Samuel B. Robertson Raymond joined the fight, launching torpedoes and firing their smaller guns in defiance of the impossible. The Japanese, confused by the aggressive counterattack and thick smoke, began to believe they were facing a much larger American force. Their formation broke down. Some ships turned away, others fired blindly. Amid the chaos, Evans' voice rang over the radio. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are between us and the carriers. We are going in." By 08:20, the Johnston was badly hit. A shell had torn through the engine room, cutting power to half the ship. Another blew apart the after gun mount. Fires raged below deck, but the crew fought on. Even wounded, the destroyer continued to harass the enemy with every functioning gun. Evans, wounded himself, shifted steering to manual control and fought from the open bridge, shouting orders through the roar of battle. Nearby, Hull and Heermann executed their own torpedo runs, drawing enemy fire. The air filled with the scream of incoming shells and the thunder of American dive bombers launching desperate attacks with machine guns and depth charges in place of bombs. Every available weapon, from carrier planes to destroyer guns, was thrown into the fight. By mid-morning, the impossible began to happen. The Japanese force, fearing greater losses and uncertain of what they were facing, began to withdraw. The giant Yamato turned north, followed by her escorts. The destroyers of Taffy III had bluffed the might of the Imperial Navy into retreat. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The Hull was sinking, the Gambier Bay lay shattered, and the Johnston, battered and smoking, drifted with engines failing. Her decks were torn open, and her guns fell silent one by one. Still, she refused to die quietly. As the Japanese ships withdrew into the distance, Evans gave one last order: "Prepare to abandon ship." The sea that had been alive with fire and fury fell eerily calm once again. The Johnston listed heavily, her colors still flying. The men in the water would watch her fade into the smoke, disappearing, as if swallowed by the very battle she had dared to challenge. Her location, and the full truth of her final moments, would remain a mystery for decades to come. By late morning on October 25, 1944, the sea off Samar was a graveyard of smoke, fire, and drifting wreckage. The battle off Samar, the final phase of the larger battle of Leyte Gulf, had reached its crescendo. Outnumbered 10-1, the men of Taffy III had done the unthinkable. They had forced the mighty Japanese center force to retreat. But the cost was staggering. Ships burned, survivors clung to debris, and amidst the chaos, the USS Johnston, the destroyer that had led the charge, was mortally wounded. At approximately 0945 hours, the Johnston was dead in the water. Shellfire had torn through her hull, her engines were gone, and she was listing hard to port. Fires raged below decks. The forward compartments were flooded, the aft guns destroyed. Yet still, Captain Ernest Evans refused to surrender. He ordered the crew to continue firing with what little ammunition remained, targeting Japanese cruisers as they passed. Men dragged wounded shipmates to safety, their faces blackened with soot and oil. From the bridge, Evans, wounded by shrapnel and burned from the heat of explosions, continued to command. When communications failed, he shouted through voice tubes and messengers. At one point, he climbed onto the deck, his left arm hanging limp, to direct fire manually. "Keep those guns firing," he yelled over the roar of shells. "Don't give them a free shot." At 0955, another volley struck the Johnston amidships. The concussion threw men from their stations. The destroyer began to roll heavily, taking on water fast. The engineering crew reported that pumps were failing. There was no stopping the flood. Evans gave the inevitable order: "Abandon ship." Those words, quiet and heavy, carried through the wrecked corridors and into the hearts of every man still alive aboard the Johnston. As the crew scrambled to life rafts and debris, the Johnston continued to fight. Her few remaining gunners, waist deep in rising water, fired until their mounts were submerged. At 1010, the destroyer's stern lifted sharply, her bow sinking into the Pacific. Survivors watched as she slipped beneath the waves, her American flag still fluttering faintly. Within minutes, she was gone, vanished into the depths of the Leyte Gulf. For those left in the water, survival was the next battle. Oil spread across the surface in thick, black slicks. The sun blazed overhead. Wounded men clung to planks and cork rafts, trying to stay afloat. Some sang to keep their spirits up. Others prayed. As hours turned to night, sharks began to appear, drawn by the carnage. Survivors fought to keep them at bay with knives, paddles, or bare hands. Chief Torpedo Man Bob Hagan, one of the few senior survivors, later recalled, "The sea was quiet except for the sound of men crying out, calling for help that couldn't come." The cries grew fewer as the hours passed. Rescue ships were nowhere in sight. The battle had moved on. The area was still considered unsafe. Elsewhere, fragments of the battle's chaos continued to unfold. The escort carrier Gambier Bay sank under relentless cruiser fire. Hull went down in flames, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts made her final torpedo run before breaking apart. The surviving carriers fled south under smoke cover, leaving the debris field behind. In the span of just 3 hours, Taffy 3 had written one of the most extraordinary and tragic chapters in naval history. For nearly 50 hours, the survivors of the Johnston drifted. Some were picked up by rescue ships days later, others never made it. Of the 327 men aboard the destroyer, only 141 were rescued. The rest were lost to the sea. Captain Evans was not among those saved. Last seen on deck, without a life jacket, he had refused assistance, choosing to stay with his ship and crew. For his courage and leadership, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American officer to receive the decoration in World War II. His citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Yet for all the honors, questions remained. Where exactly had the Johnston gone down? The coordinates recorded after the battle were uncertain, scattered amid conflicting reports and chaos. Survivors swore they saw her sink near the edge of the Philippine Trench, but others believed she drifted further before disappearing. Wartime records were incomplete, and sonar mapping in the 1940s was primitive. The Johnston seemed to vanish from history as completely as she had from the surface that morning. Over time, the story of Taffy 3 became legend, a tale of heroism studied in naval academies, retold in documentaries, yet always shadowed by mystery. The Johnston's final resting place became one of the Pacific's unanswered questions. For decades, explorers and historians tried to trace her path using after-action reports, survivor accounts, and combat logs. But the ocean, vast and indifferent, kept her secret. Somewhere off Samar, beneath miles of dark water, lay the remains of a destroyer that had defied an empire. As the war moved on and years turned to decades, the memory of the Johnston faded from public view. But for those who had fought beside her, and for the families who never saw their loved ones return, one haunting question lingered: would the Johnston ever be found? The battle off Samar was over, but for the men who had survived the sinking of the USS Johnston, their ordeal had only just begun. The destroyer had vanished beneath the waves mid-morning on October 25, 1944. Her surviving crew, battered, burned, and adrift, found themselves scattered across the debris field, clinging to anything that would float. The Pacific was merciless that day. The sea calm, the sun pitiless, and no rescue ships in sight. Chief Torpedo Man Bob Hagan later described those first hours after the Johnston went under. There was no sound except the sea and the occasional cry of a wounded man. We were covered in oil, and every wave burned our skin. The men had little fresh water, few life jackets, and almost no medical supplies. Many were wounded from shrapnel or burns. They were alone, surrounded by oil, wreckage, and silence. Evans' last words before the ship disappeared echoed in their minds: "Abandoned ship. God bless you, boys." No one saw him again. Some claimed he was last seen on the fantail, helping the wounded. Others swore he was washed overboard when the Johnston rolled. The truth, like the ship itself, was swallowed by the sea. As the hours passed, the survivors tried to stay together, forming loose clusters of rafts and debris. The heat became unbearable. Men hallucinated. Some swam toward imaginary rescue ships shimmering on the horizon, never to be seen again. Sharks circled constantly. At night, they attacked without warning, drawn by the scent of blood and fuel. "They came at us in the dark," one sailor recalled. "You could hear the water move, and then the screaming." The Japanese fleet had already withdrawn northward, believing they faced a much larger American force. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was still organizing the chaotic aftermath of Leyte Gulf. It would take more than 2 days before search planes reached the survivors' position. In that time, exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks claimed dozens of lives. When rescue finally came, it was almost by chance. The destroyer escort John C. Butler and a small patrol aircraft spotted oil slicks and movement in the water on October 27. Boats were lowered immediately. What they found were men barely alive, burned, blinded, and delirious, many clutching pieces of the Johnston's deck. Only 141 of the original 327 crew were rescued. The rest were never found. As the survivors recovered aboard hospital ships, Navy officials tried to piece together the battle's full story. Interviews revealed the scale of the Johnston's defiance. One officer from another ship reportedly said, "That little destroyer turned the entire Japanese fleet." But alongside admiration came a growing mystery. Where, exactly, had the Johnston gone down? The battle's chaos had distorted navigation data. Radar bearings conflicted with eyewitness reports. Some maps placed the wreck near the San Bernardino Strait, others near Samar's eastern ridge. 4 years, the site of the Johnston's sinking remained unconfirmed. Wartime records were sealed, and post-war priorities shifted to occupation duties and rebuilding. The Johnston became a name etched on plaques and memorials, a legend without a grave. Still, her memory endured. Captain Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation noted his dauntless leadership and unyielding determination. Surviving officers attended the ceremony, many still bearing scars from that morning off Samar. One remarked quietly to a reporter, "He said he'd go in harm's way." He kept his word. In the following decades, naval historians revisited the Johnston story. Books and lectures praised her crew's courage, but her physical fate remained a question mark. The ocean floor around Leyte Gulf was treacherous, a mix of deep trenches and shifting sediment. Sonar technology of the mid-20th century couldn't probe depths beyond a few thousand feet. And somewhere out there, beneath miles of darkness, lay the Johnston, undiscovered. For the families of the lost, that absence was a wound that never fully healed. Letters from widows and children continued to arrive at Navy archives well into the 1970s, asking whether the ship would ever be found. "We just want to know where he rests," one note read. But no definitive answer came. Occasionally, fishermen off Samar reported strange sonar readings or glimpses of twisted metal on their lines. None could be confirmed. The ocean, it seemed, was keeping her secret. As the 20th century neared its end, the battle off Samar was often described as the Navy's finest hour. Yet even in honor, the Johnston's disappearance added a haunting undertone. Her crew had fought with impossible bravery, but their ship had literally vanished, leaving behind no wreckage, no visible trace, only memory. The mystery of her final position, and whether her captain's remains might still lie within the steel hull, continued to captivate historians and explorers alike. Decades later, as deep-sea technology advanced and robotic submersibles began to map the ocean floor with unprecedented precision, a new generation of explorers set their sights on the Pacific's most elusive warship. Somewhere beneath 20,000 feet of water, in the black silence of the Philippine Trench, the Johnston waited. And soon, humanity would descend once again into the depths, searching for the truth that had slept there since 1944. For nearly 75 years after the battle off Samar, the USS Johnston remained one of the Pacific's greatest wartime enigmas. Her story was well documented in history books, her captain immortalized as a hero, but the ship itself was lost to the abyss. The exact location of her final resting place was unknown. Wartime records gave only rough coordinates, conflicting survivor reports, and vague sonar plots. The Pacific, vast and silent, had swallowed her whole. As decades passed, other wrecks from the Battle of Leyte Gulf were discovered. Pieces of the escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo, fragments of the Chokai, one of the Japanese cruisers she'd fought. But the Johnston remained missing. Historians, divers and veterans alike regarded her as a ghost of the sea, a ship too deep to reach, too small to trace, too proud to fade into history. By the 1980s, advances in undersea exploration began to rekindle hope. Remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, were charting depths once thought unreachable. Expeditions mapped the Titanic and explored hydrothermal vents thousands of feet below the surface. Yet even then, the Johnston's likely location, over 20,000 feet down near the Philippine Trench, lay beyond the limits of most civilian technology. The U.S. Navy itself had no active mission to locate her. The war's urgency had long since faded into remembrance. But for naval historians and families of the lost crew, the mystery endured. Annual reunions of Taffy-3 veterans kept the story alive. They spoke of Evans' last stand, the courage of men like Bob Hagan and gunner's mate Paul Carr, who died beside their guns, refusing to abandon their posts. "We left her out there," one survivor said in an interview in 1984, "and she's still out there fighting the sea." In the early 2000s, private research vessels began scanning deeper waters off Samar using side-scan sonar. Teams from both the United States and the Philippines recorded anomalies, echoes of possible wreckage, but none could confirm a match to the Johnston. The depths were simply too extreme. At over 6,000 meters, pressure exceeded 600 times that at sea level. Any descent required specialized submersibles costing millions. Then, in 2019, the search entered a new era. Texan entrepreneur and explorer Victor Vescovo, a retired U.S. Navy commander, had just completed the deepest solo submarine dive in history aboard his submersible DSV limiting factor. His company, Caledon Oceanic, had developed technology capable of descending to the deepest trenches on Earth, and he turned his attention to Leyte Gulf. Working in partnership with naval historians, Vescovo's team identified a probable search zone west of Samar, based on declassified wartime data and survivor testimony. For weeks, they scanned the seafloor using high-resolution sonar, mapping an area larger than Manhattan. And then, on October 30, 2019, they saw something extraordinary. At a depth of 20,400 feet, deeper than any known shipwreck at the time, the sonar image revealed a faint outline of a vessel lying upright on the seabed. Further inspection with an ROV camera confirmed it. The bow-mounted twin 5-inch gun turrets, the torpedo launchers, and a hull number, faint but unmistakable, 557. The Johnston had been found. The wreck was shattered but dignified. Her forward half was remarkably intact, the bridge still recognizable, the guns still aimed toward the direction of the Japanese fleet she had charged. No human remains were disturbed. Her stern lay several hundred meters away, torn off during her descent. The crew of the limiting factor observed a moment of silence as they hovered before the wreck, a destroyer frozen in the act of defiance, resting in the eternal dark. Vescovo later said in a statement, "It was an honor to locate this ship. She represents the very best of those who fought in World War II, courage, duty, and sacrifice." Naval historians were stunned. Not only had the deepest known shipwreck been located, but it had been one of the war's most legendary. The discovery didn't just close a chapter in history, it reawakened it. The images showed the Johnston's gun mounts still loaded, her barrels trained upward, as though still defying the enemy. Rustic lace hung like ribbons, but the ship's form was unmistakable. It was both a relic and a monument, preserved by pressure and cold in the darkness of the Philippine Trench. For the families of the fallen, the news was bittersweet. Memorial services were held across the United States. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, descendants of Ernest Evans gathered to hear a recording of the moment the wreck was confirmed. One relative said quietly, "He finally came home, not to land, but to memory." The Johnston's rediscovery also revived scholarly interest in the battle off Samar. Analysts revisited tactical maps, confirming that the ship had indeed turned the Japanese line and contributed directly to their retreat. What had once seemed a hopeless act of bravery was now understood as a decisive moment that changed the course of the Pacific War. Yet even as the mystery was solved, a deeper one remained, a question not of location, but of spirit. How did a single destroyer and her crew achieve what entire fleets could not? How did Evans' defiance ripple across the decades, drawing explorers to the darkest depths to find his ship? The ocean had held her secret for 75 years. Now, revealed again to the world, the Johnston stood not as a ghost, but as a testament, a reminder that courage can echo across time, and that even in the deepest darkness, light can find its way down. When explorers finally found the USS Johnston in 2019, lying upright and eerily preserved nearly 4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, it marked not just the end of a search, but the restoration of memory. The little destroyer, once lost to the deep, had been rediscovered in the black stillness of the abyss. The find was historic. At 20,400 feet, the Johnston became the deepest shipwreck ever identified and surveyed. But for those who knew her story, it was far more than a technical achievement. It was an act of remembrance, a long-delayed reunion between the living and the lost. The footage taken by Victor Vescovo's DSV limiting factor showed the ship in remarkable condition. Her hull number, 557, was visible on the bow. Gun turrets remained trained toward the direction of the Japanese fleet, as if she were still fighting. Her bridge was scarred by impact, but the destroyer's lines were unmistakable. No human remains were disturbed, but the presence of scattered helmets, cables, and ammunition served as silent testimony to the crew who had gone down with her. "It's as though time stopped at the moment of her last stand," said one of the mission's engineers. "She's still on the attack." The discovery reverberated around the naval world. Historians and veterans' families alike were moved to tears. For decades, the Johnston had existed only in stories and records, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. Now, her image, lying peacefully in the deep, gave those stories shape and truth. The U.S. Navy formally recognized the discovery, calling it a moment of closure for one of our most gallant ships. Admiral Samuel Papireau later commented, "The Johnston represents what it means to fight with everything you have, even when the odds say you can't win." In the following years, further dives were conducted to fully document the wreck using advanced 4K imaging. The data revealed new insights into the ship's final minutes. Damage patterns suggested that the Johnston had continued firing until moments before sinking, confirming survivors' accounts. Her torpedo tubes were empty, all launched. Even after losing power, she had remained aggressive, fighting literally until her last breath. For the families of the fallen, seeing the images was overwhelming. Many had grown up with only fragments of their father's or grandfather's stories, a few letters, a photo, a medal. Now they could see the ship that had defined their family's legacy. Memorial ceremonies were held from Washington to Tulsa, and wreaths were laid over the coordinates where the wreck rested. The U.S. Navy released a statement affirming that the site would be treated as a war grave, undisturbed, sacred, and eternal. The rediscovery also renewed appreciation for the Battle off Samar itself. Once overshadowed by larger naval engagements like Midway or the Philippine Sea, Samar came to be recognized as one of the most courageous actions in U.S. naval history. In official reports, the Johnston's attack was described as audacious beyond reason. Tactically, it disrupted the Japanese line, saving the escort carriers and the invasion force from annihilation. Strategically, it embodied the spirit of a navy that refused to yield, no matter the odds. Yet beyond the history and heroism, there remained a haunting beauty in the story, a sense of unfinished conversation between the living and the dead. The Pacific had kept the Johnston safe, guarding her like a monument far beyond the reach of time. When the lights of the limiting factor illuminated her deck again after 75 years of darkness, it was as if the ocean itself had chosen the right moment to give her back. In interviews following the dive, Vescovo reflected quietly, "Down there, it's absolute silence. The ship sits upright, proud, unbroken. It feels less like a wreck, more like a memorial built by the sea itself." His words captured what many felt, that the Johnston had never truly been lost, only waiting to be seen again. For the modern Navy, the destroyer's rediscovery became a symbol of legacy, a reminder of the values that define those who serve: courage, initiative, sacrifice. Her story began in the chaos of war, but ended in the calm of remembrance. Every frame of the deep-sea footage, every rivet and rusted plate, seemed to whisper the same truth, that honor endures even in the darkest depths. In 2021, on the 77th anniversary of the Battle off Samar, sailors aboard modern destroyers paused for a minute of silence. The names of the Johnston's crew were read aloud. Among them, Ernest E. Evans, Medal of Honor recipient; Bob Hagan, Chief Torpedo Man; Paul Carr, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class, who had died beside his gun mount; asking for shells to continue firing even as the ship sank. Their courage, once scattered in the waves, had finally come home. Today, the USS Johnston rests quietly on the seafloor, 6,500 meters below, beyond sunlight, beyond sound. Her decks are covered in a fine layer of silt, her guns still facing the enemy she once charged. No storms disturb her. No tides reach her. She lies where she fell, unyielding, proud, defiant. And though her steel has faded, her story shines brighter than ever. Because the Johnston was never just a ship. She was a promise, that even in the darkest hour, when defeat seems certain, valor can still light the way. Her rediscovery did more than solve a mystery. It reminded the world that some heroes never truly disappear. They wait beneath the waves, keeping watch over the silence of history, until at last, we remember them.